Our group presentation will be about hemispheric specialization, and the members are Celine, Connor, Craig, Dima, and Katie. The left and right hemispheres process the world we live in differently. When we study patients who have undergone colostomy procedures, we gain an understanding of the importance of hemispheric specialization. The right hemisphere has more of a visuospatial interpreter ability, while the left hemisphere has more of a general day-to-day interpreter function. Understanding the different interpretation functions of the hemisphere allows us to further understand the similarities and differences between them. The following studies exemplify just that. In the next slides, we will look at hemispheric differences in mnemonic processing, the effects of left hemispheric interpretation, and visuospatial processing in the right hemisphere interpreter.
To further explore the distinct interpreter functions of the two hemispheres, we will be focusing on two studies that specifically address these differences. The first study we're going to discuss, titled Hemispheric Differences in Mnemonic Processing, the Effects of Left Hemispheric Interpretation, was conducted by Michael Gazzaniga and Elizabeth Phelps in 1992. It focuses on how differences in the hemisphere's interpretive abilities affect mnemonic processing and memory. The study begins by asking the general question: do differences in inferential abilities between the hemispheres differentially affect cognitive processing in the hemispheres? The researchers then ask the more specific question: do these differences in the interpretive abilities of the hemispheres particularly apply to or affect memory and mnemonic processing? The main hypothesis of the study is that the stronger inferential abilities in the left hemisphere do indeed influence the way it deals with memory and mnemonic processing. Alternatively, however, the researchers hypothesized that the different inferential abilities of the two hemispheres do not apply to mnemonic and memory processing. So, if the main hypothesis is indeed correct, the researchers should find hemispheric differences in inferential abilities reflected in performance on a memory task given separately to each hemisphere. In contrast, if the researchers' alternative hypothesis is true, results would show that there is no difference between the hemispheres' performances on the memory task.
In order to test their hypothesis, Phelps and Gazzaniga enlisted the help of patient JW and VP, both of whom previously had their corpus callosities completely severed to treat their severe epilepsy. Each of them were shown 3 sets of 80 pictures. 60 of the pictures had a logical order of events, and 20 of the 80 had no relevance. Of the 60 relevant pictures, 40 were shown during the acquisitional stage, and 20 were shown as distractors. The sets were all shown on different days. The pictures were shown in chronological order and appeared on the screen for 3 seconds. After the first showing, the 20 distractors were mixed in with the within-scene pictures, and then they were all shown at random. An hour and a half after the presentations, the subjects were shown the pictures once more. They were given as much time as they needed to decide if they had seen the pictures. Once they made their decision, they were told to look at a fixation point, and the words yes or no were flashed in the upper or lower portion of the screen, and either to left or right. If the answer was on the left, the subject was told to use their left hand to point, and vice versa. The pictures were divided for each hemisphere to respond to 40 of the 80 pictures. For JW, the percentage of correct answers was 70% for the right hemisphere and 65% for the left hemisphere. For VP, the percentage of correct answers was 69% for the right hemisphere and 64% for the left hemisphere. Both patients performed similarly for original images and out-of-scene distractors. When it came to within-scene distractors, the left hemisphere performed significantly worse than the right. JW had 63% correct for the right and 33% correct for the left. VP had 63% correct for the right and 40% correct for the left. These results are consistent with the idea that the right and left hemispheres perform differently when recognizing pictures. The right hemisphere performed better than the left in the visual memory task, but the left hemisphere had an above-chance performance with the original and out-of-scene pictures. This suggests that the right hemisphere relies on processing visual stimuli, while the left hemisphere relies on higher-order interpretive processing of mnemonic stimuli.
This next study we are going to discuss is on the right hemisphere's role as interpreter. The study is titled Visuospatial Processing in the Right Hemisphere Interpreter, and it was conducted by Paul M. Corballis in 2003. The broad question being discussed in this article is, what are the differences in function for the right and left hemisphere? This gives an overview of the general topic of related interest being examined. In the study, the role of the different hemispheres is examined to determine dominance and codominance. The specific question being asked is, does the right hemisphere have a visuospatial interpretive function? This article seeks to challenge the idea that the left hemisphere is more dominant and suggested that both hemispheres possess specialized abilities of their own, and that the right hemisphere's role is not just minor but also has interpretive function. The main hypothesis being tested in this study is that the right hemisphere is involved in interpretive functionality with its known superior visuospatial abilities. The alternative hypothesis discussed is that the left hemisphere acts as the sole interpreter for the brain with little to no involvement from the right hemisphere. If the first hypothesis is correct, then there will be activity in the right hemisphere for split brain patients for visuospatial tasks that have interpretive functionality, indicating that the right hemisphere is involved in interpretation. If the second hypothesis is correct, then there will be no transfer of neuronal activity during visuospatial interpretive tasks in the right hemisphere to the left, leaving split brain patients unable to complete the tasks successfully. This indicates that the right hemisphere does not have interpretive function because the ability to interpret is on the left hemisphere.
In order to illustrate his hypothesis, Corballis collected research from various studies and combined them to systematically prove his point. He started by identifying studies that go into depth about the organization of the visual system. At earlier stages, visual representations are processed by each hemisphere uniquely, while at later stages the representations are shared between the hemispheres. This allows for lateralization in the processing of these representations, due to the fact information of representations are shared equally on both sides and no information would be lost. Thus, higher level processing is lateralized to the right hemisphere. Next, Corballis explains that visual processing is an intelligent process worthy of being labeled interpretation. At levels of higher processing that are lateralized, the visual representations undergo more abstract processing, which are easily influenced by higher level cognitive functions deemed intelligent. Corballis sums up his points that lateralization occurs for higher level visual processing, and that it is an interpretive function through two studies. The first task shown is the modified Kanisa square task. The first picture displays modal completion since we can see the contours or outline of the square easily within the circles. The outline of the square is clear, so it requires no interpretation. The second picture displays amodal completion, which we are unable to see the outline of the square anymore unless we utilize interpretation to see it. Our brain must interpret the square to be there through higher level cognitive functions since it is unclear by the outline if the square is indeed there. The right hemisphere does significantly better at being able to distinguish the square in the amodal completion task over the left hemisphere. However, they perform equally well for the modal completion task that requires little interpretive abilities. The second study that finds a similar result is the illusory line motion task. In this task, a line is presented as if being drawn, giving the illusion of movement in a particular direction. A dot can be inserted at the start to make it appear the line is coming from the dot. However, the task can be modified to change the line width or color, and given a particular width or color of a dot, the line can appear to be moving out of one dot over another if the dot and line have the same matching characteristics. Again, this displays interpretation of visual spatial information, and again, the right hemisphere does significantly better than the left hemisphere on this task. It is then concluded that from Corballis' research that the right hemisphere can also be considered an interpreter, but in the realm of visual spatial processing.
In conclusion, the two hemispheres are responsible for different interpreting tasks. The right hemisphere acts as more of a visual spatial interpreter, while the left acts as a world interpreter. Intelligence seems to be left lateralized, but in reality, it's just interpreting the world around us and rationalizes the behavior of the right hemisphere.